At 33, I had exactly $34 to my name. My fiancée had left me for my business partner, and together they legally stole my life's work. I was sleeping in a freezing Honda Civic when a dead man gifted me a cursed piece of rock that changed everything. The frost on the inside of my windshield was thick enough to scrape off with a fingernail. I woke up shivering violently, my knees pressed against the steering wheel of my 2008 Honda Civic, parked in a bleak 24-hour Walmart lot just outside of Boston. It was mid-November. 3 weeks earlier, I had been the CEO of Aura Dynamics, a logistics software company valued at $40 million. I lived in a sprawling loft in Cambridge. I was engaged to a woman named Rachel, a corporate architect with a blinding smile and a taste for the finer things. Then came the Series B funding round. My co-founder and supposed best friend, Colin, had quietly orchestrated a boardroom coup. Using a buried mezzanine financing clause, a highly predatory legal loophole we had signed during our desperate early days, Colin partnered with our lead investors at Pinnacle Ventures to trigger a drag-along rights execution. They diluted my founder shares to less than 1% overnight. When I threatened to sue, they fired me for erratic leadership. I came home that same afternoon, completely numb, hoping to find solace in Rachel. Instead, I found Colin's BMW parked in my driveway. Rachel didn't even have the decency to cry. She stood in the foyer, holding her designer coat, and calmly explained that she needed stability, and Colin was the future of the company. In less than 48 hours, I lost my business, my best friend, my fiancée, and my home. The legal fees from my desperate, failed attempt to fight the takeover drained my personal accounts, which brought me to the front seat of a freezing car, $34 to my name, staring at a half-eaten sleeve of saltines. My phone buzzed on the dashboard. It was an unknown number, which I usually ignored, assuming it was another debt collector, but the caller ID flashed Ropes and Gray LLP, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Massachusetts. I answered, my voice raspy from the cold. "Artheon Pendleton?" a crisp, authoritative voice asked. "Speaking." "My name is Thomas Albright, senior partner at Ropes and Gray. I am the executor of the estate for the late Nathaniel Reed, your grandfather. He passed away on Tuesday. I need you in my office at noon today for the reading of his will." I blinked, my breath pluming in the freezing car. Nathaniel Reed was a ghost. My mother's father had been completely estranged from the family since the late 1990s. He was a rumored fixer and independent logistics contractor who spent most of his life bouncing between Panama, Zurich, and Southeast Asia. The family joked he was either a spy or a smuggler. No one had spoken to him in 20 years. "I don't have a suit," I said, the absurdity of the situation overriding my manners. "I don't care what you wear, Mr. Pendleton. Just be here," Albright replied, and hung up. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a terrifyingly pristine, glass-walled conference room on the 45th floor of the Prudential Tower. I was wearing a wrinkled flannel shirt and jeans that smelled faintly of stale coffee. Across from me sat Thomas Albright, a man whose bespoke suit probably cost more than my car. Albright didn't waste time. He opened a thick leather binder. "Nathaniel Reed was a complicated man," Albright began, his tone devoid of emotion. "He left behind a sizable estate, liquid assets totaling roughly $14 million, several properties in Europe, and a massive portfolio of blue-chip stocks. My heart hammered against my ribs. 14 million. Just a fraction of that would allow me to hire the ruthless litigators I needed to destroy Colin and take my company back. I leaned forward, the exhaustion suddenly vanishing from my bones. However, Albright continued, turning a page, your grandfather was also deeply eccentric. The entirety of his liquid assets, properties, and stock portfolios have been placed into an irrevocable trust benefiting various marine conservation charities. You receive none of it. The air left my lungs. Nothing? Not entirely. He left a specific codicil for his only living grandson. Albright slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. He left you Cormorant Rock. I frowned, staring at the envelope. What is Cormorant Rock? A 3-acre island off the coast of Machiasport, Maine. It consists entirely of granite, dead pine trees, and a dilapidated hunting cabin built in 1968. It is accessible only by boat, and only during high tide. Furthermore, because your grandfather neglected to pay Knox County property taxes on it for the last 14 years, there is an outstanding tax lien of $42,000 attached to the deed. By accepting this inheritance, you assume the debt. I stared at the lawyer, my hands trembling. He left me a rock and $42,000 in debt. I have $34 in my checking account. I'm homeless. I can't pay that. If you don't pay it within 30 days, the county will seize the island, Albright said, closing his binder. There is a developer, Coastal Heritage Group, that buys up seized coastal properties for pennies. They've already expressed interest in the water rights. You could try to sell it to them quickly, perhaps for a few $1,000s, to clear the debt and walk away with a bus ticket. But as of right now, Artheon, you are a landowner. He handed me a heavy brass key and a stack of legal documents. I walked out of the skyscraper into the biting Boston wind, holding a deed to a worthless rock. I had hit rock bottom, and my dead grandfather had just handed me a shovel. I drove up the coast of Maine in a blinding fury, my heater broken, surviving on gas station coffee. Machiasport was a rugged working-class lobstering town where the Atlantic Ocean looked grey, violent, and utterly unforgiving. Down at the docks, I found a grizzled, sour-faced lobsterman named Captain Elias Cobb, who agreed to take me out to Cormorant Rock for $20 and a 6-pack of cheap beer. As his diesel boat smashed through the icy 6-foot swells of the Atlantic, I finally saw my inheritance. It was a jagged, ugly tooth of black granite jutting out of the violent sea. Dead, twisted pine trees clung to the rocks like skeletal fingers. Perched precariously on the highest ridge was a weather-beaten cabin with a sagging roof and blown-out windows. It looked like the setting of a horror movie. "Ain't nothing out there but seagull crap and misery, son," Elias yelled over the roar of the diesel engine, pulling the boat up to a rotting wooden dock. "Storms rolling in tonight. A nor'easter. I ain't coming back for you until tomorrow afternoon. You sure you want to stay?" "I have nowhere else to go," I muttered, grabbing my duffel bag. I hopped onto the slippery, algae-covered dock. Elias gave me a look of genuine pity, revved his engine, and disappeared into the grey mist, leaving me entirely alone. The wind was already howling as I hiked up the steep, rocky path to the cabin. I shoved the heavy brass key into the rusted lock, but I didn't need to. The door was already hanging off its hinges. Inside it was freezing and smelled of rot and sea salt. The furniture consisted of a single mouldy mattress, a heavy cast-iron wood stove, and a table covered in decades of dust. By 6 p.m., the nor'easter hit. The temperature plummeted to 15 degrees. The wind shrieked through the broken windows, and freezing rain lashed against the wood. I huddled in the corner, wrapped in every piece of clothing I owned, shivering so violently my teeth felt loose. I was going to freeze to death on this rock. Desperate, I realized I needed a fire. There was no firewood, so I grabbed a rusted crowbar I found in the corner and started tearing up the rotting floorboards near the wood stove. I struck the wood, splintering it, tearing it away in jagged chunks. On my third swing, the crowbar didn't hit wood. It struck metal. Clang. I paused, wiping freezing rain and sweat from my eyes. I dropped to my knees and used my raw, bleeding hands to pull away more of the rotten pine boards. Hidden directly beneath the cast-iron stove, which acted as a massive immobile weight, was a heavy steel hatch. It was flush with the granite foundation, sealed with a thick rubber gasket. There was a heavy wheel lock in the center. My heart pounded against my ribs. I grabbed the wheel and strained with every ounce of strength I had left. With a grinding shriek of rusted metal, the wheel turned. I threw my weight backward, and the heavy steel door heaved open. A blast of warm, dry, stale air hit my face, carrying the distinct smell of machine oil and ozone. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight app, and pointed it down the hole. A narrow, spiraling staircase, carved directly into the black granite, led down into total darkness. My hands were shaking, and it had nothing to do with the freezing cold. I gripped the crowbar tightly and began to descend. The stairs went deep, at least 50 feet below the surface, plunging right into the bedrock of the island. At the bottom, my flashlight beam swept across a massive subterranean sea cave. The space was enormous, echoing with the distant rhythmic booming of ocean waves crashing against some hidden outer wall. But the cave wasn't natural. The walls had been reinforced with heavy steel beams and poured concrete. Halogen work lights were strung along the ceiling, wired to a massive silent diesel generator in the corner. And in the center of the cavern sat a colossal bank-grade vault door embedded seamlessly into the stone. It was a Diebold Nixdorf vault, the kind used in Federal Reserves, protected by a biometric scanner and a massive combination wheel. My grandfather hadn't been a simple smuggler. He had built an off-the-grid fortress. I approached the vault, my mind racing. There was no way I could break into this, but as I got closer, I noticed something chilling. The heavy steel door wasn't locked. It was cracked open about 2 inches, the locking bolts retracted. Someone had been here, or someone had left in a hurry. I wedged the crowbar into the gap and leaned all my weight against it. The massive door groaned, fighting the friction, before slowly swinging open to reveal the interior. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the pitch black. The vault was roughly the size of a tennis court, lined with industrial steel shelving, and the shelves were not empty. My light hit the first row and caught the dull, heavy gleam of gold. I walked over, my breath catching in my throat. Stacked neatly were hundreds of heavy, rectangular bricks. I picked one up. It weighed almost 30 pounds. Stamped into the metal was the seal of the Valcambi refinery in Switzerland. A single gold bar of this size was worth nearly $750,000. There were dozens of them, but the gold was just the beginning. On the next shelf sat rows of waterproof, military-grade Pelican cases. I popped the latches on the nearest one. Inside, vacuum-sealed in heavy plastic, were stacks of bearer bonds. Unregistered, fully negotiable bearer bonds from the 1980s, largely outlawed today, but still entirely valid if cashed quietly. Each certificate was printed with a denomination of $100,000. There were thousands of them. Next to the bonds were velvet-lined wooden crates. I pried one open with the crowbar. The light hit a bed of raw, uncut diamonds, massive, cloudy stones the size of walnuts, alongside flawless, brilliant-cut sapphires. This wasn't just a rich man's stash. This was the dark treasury of empires. Bribes, black market arms deals, laundered cartel money. My grandfather had been the offshore bank for the world's most dangerous people, and he had buried their money beneath a worthless rock in Maine. I was standing in the middle of $1 billion secret. I dropped the crowbar. The clatter echoed loudly against the steel walls. I was a billionaire. I could buy back my company. I could crush Colin into dust. I could buy Rachel's new life and burn it down for sport. Suddenly, the beam of my phone flashlight flickered and died. I plunged into total, suffocating darkness. "Damn it!" I hissed, tapping the screen to revive it. But the battery had frozen and died. In the sudden heavy silence of the vault, a new sound emerged. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the ocean. It was the unmistakable, deep-throated growl of a tactical Zodiac boat engine, cutting out just outside the hidden sea entrance of the cave. A second later, the heavy thud of a rubber hull hit the rocks. Then came the sound that made my blood run ice-cold. Click-clack, the sharp, metallic sound of an assault rifle being chambered. "Sweep the cavern!" A deep, heavily accented voice echoed through the dark tunnel. "If Reed's grandson is down here, put a bullet in his head and dump him in the tide. We're taking the vault tonight." I backed into the darkness of the vault, clutching my useless, dead phone, as 3 beams of high-powered tactical flashlights pierced the gloom of the cave, moving straight toward the open vault door. The heavy beams of 3 tactical flashlights sliced through the pitch-black cavern, their harsh white light bouncing off the poured concrete walls. I pressed myself flat against the cold steel of the vault's interior shelving, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought the intruders might hear it. I held my breath, clutching the dead phone in my left hand and the heavy Valcambi gold brick in my right. "Spread out," the leader barked. His voice was thick with an Eastern European accent. He moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of a professional operator, an FN SCAR assault rifle tucked tight against his shoulder. "Check the perimeter. Gallagher wants confirmation the Pendleton kid is dead before we start hauling the Pelican cases." The name hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Gallagher. Richard Gallagher was the senior managing partner at Pinnacle Ventures, the exact venture capital firm that had colluded with Colin to steal my software company, Aura Dynamics. My mind spun, connecting the terrifying, impossible dots. The leader pulled a satellite phone from his tactical vest, the screen casting a pale green glow over his scarred jawline. He hit a speed dial and put it on speaker. "Gallagher," the mercenary said, his voice echoing in the massive vault. "Tell me you're inside, Victor." Richard Gallagher's voice crackled through the tiny speaker. It was the same arrogant, patrician drawl that had dismissed me in the boardroom 3 weeks ago. "We are inside the vault. It's open. The old man's stash is all here. Valcambi gold, the bearer bonds, the stones. But the door was cracked when we arrived. The kid is here." A low, cruel laugh hissed over the satellite feed. "I told you my grandfather wasn't crazy. He spent 30 years hunting Nathaniel Reed's black market treasury. I didn't bankrupt Artheon's pathetic little tech company and coordinate with his snake of a co-founder just for fun, Victor. I stripped the kid of everything so he would be desperate enough to claim the island and trigger the lawyer's deed transfer. He was our bloodhound. I closed my eyes, a sickening wave of betrayal washing over me. Colin hadn't just stolen my company and my fiancée. He had sold me out to a corporate predator who used my life's work as a pawn to find a pirate's treasure. Rachel, Colin, the bankruptcy. It was all a manufactured tragedy designed to herd me into this underground tomb. "Find him," Gallagher commanded over the phone. "Put a hollow point in his skull, weight the body, and dump him in the high tide. Then load the gold." The line went dead. Fear evaporated, instantly replaced by a blinding, white-hot rage. I was no longer the broken, freezing man sleeping in a Honda Civic. I was Nathaniel Reed's blood, and I was standing inside my grandfather's fortress. The three mercenaries stepped fully into the massive Diebold Nixdorf vault, their flashlight beams sweeping the aisles. They were 50 feet away from me, moving deeper into the room. The heavy steel vault door remained open behind them, the only exit back to the sea cave. I needed a distraction. I needed them at the far end of the vault. I crouched low, feeling around the shelf beside me in the dark. My fingers brushed against a heavy canvas sack. I pulled the drawstring open just enough to feel the cold, ridged edges of coins, old South African Krugerrands. The bag easily weighed 40 pounds. Waiting until Victor and his men turned down the center aisle, I hurled the heavy gold brick I was holding as hard as I could toward the back left corner of the vault. It smashed into a stack of wooden crates with a deafening, splintering crash. Instantly, all three tactical lights whipped toward the noise. "Over there! Move!" Victor shouted. The men sprinted down the aisle, their combat boots pounding against the steel floor grates, rifles raised. This was my only chance. I grabbed the canvas sack of Krugerrands, slinging it over my shoulder, and grabbed the handle of a waterproof Pelican case filled with bearer bonds. Dragging 50 pounds of wealth, I sprinted barefoot in the opposite direction, slipping silently through the pitch-black perimeter aisle toward the vault entrance. I broke out of the vault into the dimly lit sea cavern. I dropped the bags and grabbed the massive steel wheel on the outside of the Diebold Nixdorf door. The hinges groaned as I threw all my body weight backward. The sound of moving steel echoed like a gunshot. Victor spun around, his flashlight beam pinning me in the doorway. He realized instantly what was happening. "No, stop him!" He raised his FN SCAR and fired. Crack, crack, crack. Bullets sparked and screamed off the 3-foot-thick titanium frame of the door, raining hot shrapnel onto my shoulders. I screamed, pulling with every ounce of adrenaline in my veins. The perfectly balanced hinges gave way, and the colossal door swung shut with a terrifying, absolute finality. Boom! The impact shook the bedrock. I immediately spun the heavy exterior locking wheel, throwing the massive steel deadbolts into place. I heard the muffled, frantic hammering of fists and rifle butts against the inside of the door. But it was useless. The vault was airtight, soundproof, and impenetrable. They were buried alive in a billion-dollar coffin. I stood in the cavern, gasping for air, bleeding from a superficial shrapnel cut on my cheek. I picked up the Pelican case and the sack of Krugerrands. Walking to the edge of the subterranean water basin, I found their tactical Zodiac boat tied to a rusted iron ring. The keys were still in the ignition. I loaded the money, untied the line, and fired up the twin outboard motors. As I blasted out of the hidden sea cave into the raging, freezing nor'easter, I didn't look back. I had survived the night. Now I was going to buy my revenge. 3 months later, the spring sun was shining brightly over the Swiss Alps. I was sitting in a private mahogany-paneled suite at the Pictet Group headquarters in Geneva, sipping espresso. Across from me sat a senior wealth manager who was sweating through his bespoke Tom Ford suit. "Mr. Pendleton," the banker said, his voice trembling slightly as he stared at the stacks of 1980s bearer bonds covering his desk. "We have authenticated the certificates. They are entirely valid. Factoring in the accumulated compound interest over the last 4 decades, the total liquid deposit into your numbered accounts will be $842 million US, completely untraceable." "Excellent," I said, setting down my espresso cup. "Wire 50 million of it immediately to the retainer accounts of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meher and Flom in New York. Tell them I want to launch an aggressive, hostile debt acquisition campaign. The target is Pinnacle Ventures." The transformation from a homeless software developer to an apex financial predator was seamless. Wealth is a superpower. Untraceable, offshore wealth is a weapon of mass destruction. I didn't just want to sue Richard Gallagher or Colin. Lawsuits could be dragged out for years. I wanted to dismantle their entire reality, piece by piece, just as they had done to me. Over the next 6 weeks, operating through a labyrinth of anonymous shell companies managed by Skadden Arps, I began buying up the highly leveraged, toxic debt that Pinnacle Ventures used to fund their hostile takeovers. Gallagher was arrogant. He had overextended his firm, relying on a booming tech market to cover his massive loans. When the market dipped, his creditors demanded more collateral. I bought out those creditors. Overnight, I became Richard Gallagher's absolute master. The trap finally snapped shut on a rainy Tuesday in late May. I walked into the glass-walled boardroom of Aura Dynamics in Cambridge, the very room where I had been fired. Standing at the head of the table, holding a glass of champagne, was Colin. Next to him was Rachel, wearing a diamond engagement ring that caught the light. At the far end of the table sat Richard Gallagher, reviewing a merger document, his gold Rolex Daytona gleaming on his wrist. They were celebrating the sale of my software to a Silicon Valley conglomerate. When the oak doors swung open and I walked in, wearing a sharp midnight blue Brioni suit, the laughter died instantly. "Artheon," Colin stammered, his face draining of color. "What the hell are you doing here? Security is supposed to keep you out." Rachel took a step back, her eyes wide, staring at my tailored clothes and the sheer, terrifying calm on my face. "Artheon, you need to leave. You're trespassing." "Trespassing?" Richard Gallagher looked up from his papers. His eyes narrowed. He was the only one who realized something was horribly wrong. He hadn't heard from Victor's mercenary team in 3 months. He thought I was rotting at the bottom of the Atlantic. "Hello, Richard," I said smoothly, walking to the head of the table. I tossed a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto the polished glass. "I believe you're sitting in my chair." Gallagher stood up, his jaw tight. "I don't know how you're alive, Pendleton, but you don't own a single share of this company anymore. Get out before I have you arrested." "I don't own shares, Richard. I own you," I replied, leaning forward, resting my knuckles on the table. "Through Blackstone Holdings, a private equity proxy, I have acquired 100% of Pinnacle Ventures' outstanding mezzanine debt, all $400 million of it, and as of 8 a.m. this morning, I have called the loans in due to breach of covenant." Gallagher's face went chalk white. His Rolex ticked loudly in the silent room. You can't have that kind of capital. It's impossible." "You sent your dogs to my grandfather's island, Richard," I whispered, my voice cold as ice. "But you forgot one thing. It was my island. I turned to Colin, who was visibly shaking, looking between me and Gallagher for an explanation. Colin, I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. During my forensic audit of Pinnacle's books, my lawyers found the wire transfers Gallagher sent to your offshore accounts in the Caymans. Bribes to orchestrate my ouster. Corporate espionage, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The FBI raided your condo 20 minutes ago. They found the hard drives. Colin dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. Artheon, please, save it for the federal prosecutor, I interrupted, turning my gaze to Rachel. She looked utterly terrified, instinctively clutching her designer purse. You wanted stability, Rachel. I suggest you get a good job, because Colin's assets are frozen, and he's going to federal prison for the next decade. I looked back at Gallagher. The powerful, arrogant venture capitalist looked like a deflated balloon, his empire collapsing in real time. I am liquidating Pinnacle Ventures, I told him, turning my back and walking toward the door. Aura Dynamics is returning to my control. You have nothing left, Richard. If you ever come near me or my property again, I will lock you in a dark room underground, and I will throw away the key. I walked out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving the three of them standing in the wreckage of their ruined lives. A month later, I stood on the rocky cliffs of Cormorant Rock. The nor'easter storms had passed, and the Atlantic Ocean sparkled brilliantly under the summer sun. A team of structural engineers from Boston was surveying the land behind me, drawing up blueprints. I wasn't going to sell the island. I was going to build a fortress over it. I looked down at the heavy brass key in my hand, the one my grandfather had left me. He had been a criminal, a ghost, and a deeply flawed man. But he had given me the one thing I needed most when the world stripped me bare: the power to fight back. I pocketed the key, smiled at the horizon, and walked back toward the docks. The empire was finally mine. If you thought surviving a freezing island was intense, just wait until you hear what I found hidden inside those secret Zurich accounts. This is just the beginning of my journey from a homeless founder to a billionaire ghost. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder to never give up, and subscribe to the channel for the next chapter. Drop a comment below. What would you do with $1 billion vault? See you next time.